This call is now being.
Hi, guys. Welcome to What is a Rouge Doula? And I'm
Hi,
Lynsey,
I'm Phoebe.
and we're going to be taking you on a little journey today looking at the micro, the macro, and the global. So, with the micro, we want to look at ourselves and understand who we are individually as doulas, the different aspects of ourselves that we're healing, the different triggers that we might have, and also the strengths that we bring to the table. The macro is how we treat each other, how we work in community together, how we handle conflict, how we handle anything that arises between our ranks, and then the structures and the tools we have for repair and healing within our own community. And then, of course, the global. How do we treat abortion clients? How do we treat people from other organizations? How do we handle those kinds of conflicts and just general challenges of the overall feminist movement that might exist?
Yeah, so should we start with the micro, Lynsey? Do you want to talk about that first and we can kind of move out?
Yeah, let's start with the micro. And this is something that we'll continue to discuss within our smaller groups, but really understanding your own strengths and limitations and where you are in your own healing journey. For example, I think I had a personal experience of dealing with abortion regret. And it took me completely by surprise because I work in this field. However, when I was counseling people with a similar experience or going through a certain level of ambivalence after that, I was almost doing extra or almost trying to stop them from having an abortion because of like my own experience. And I really had to check myself in a few of those situations and sort of see that although I do have life experience in this work, I hadn't done enough healing to maybe take some of those cases effectively. And then only through doing enough healing work and coming out the other side where I'm not crying about that baby anymore and have healed that piece of grief, am I now able to really truly support people from a place of strength and knowledge and wisdom. And so looking at those different pieces in yourself of a pretty big rupture that maybe could cause a level of projection within yourself with clients, or a prejudice because maybe there's someone or something that hurt you, and then it's the opposite effect of what I described. But it's those pieces, those thorns that if we can heal them, they become our greatest rose. They become our greatest asset. And it's an honor for me personally to be able to continue a lot of this work around abortion, trauma, and healing specifically, because I was able to heal it myself and then work to forward this work. So I challenge and invite each of you to figure out, what is your thorn, or what was your thorn? What is that piece of you that really can only be ignited into magic once it's been healed and transmuted and alchemized in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really easy sometimes as counselors to be like, okay, I'm going to go into this counseling session. I'm just going to put everything aside. I'm going to nothing that's going on with me internally is going to affect this. And I think that's like a really easy trap to fall into. But at the end of the day, the truth is that is not possible with the kind of work we do, like doulaing, at least as we practice it here at Rouge, is very intimate. We are a mirror for our clients, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we're not, blank slates ourselves. That's not possible. So like whatever is going on with you, you are gonna bring that into the room with the client. And so I think it's really important, that we are taking stock of, like Lynsey said, like, what is that piece? What's that experience? What's that pre-existing belief that I might be at risk of projecting onto this client? And then instead of just being like, oh, I got to make sure not to do that, you need to actually take the time with yourself to reflect and figure out, like, what is that hurt piece of me that I'm trying to heal through this client, and then take the time to heal it on your own in other ways in community, but not in the room with your clients.
Mm-hmm. And it is the goal, and we're going to get deeper into this in the global, but you want to be a neutral reflection to the client. You want to be a safe space where they can explore whatever it is they're experiencing, and you're able to reflect back to them what's going on for them and have the absence of projections, either positive or negative. Even there can also be problems if you relate too closely to a client and you're just like really cheering them on. It can also be damaging if it's too much. So it's like finding a healthy medium in all of these things to best be of service in those spaces. And you don't have to be a neutral reflection with the rest of the doulas, with your girlfriends, in your normal life. It's just like when you come into this space, it's figuring out what aspects you need to leave at the door.
Yeah, and I think that gets talked about a lot in counseling, the idea, and in counseling education, certainly in a lot of my previous counseling education, that idea of being a neutral reflection. But I think that sometimes what gets missed is that, like, that's not something you can just do, right? You can't just turn it on. It's something that you have to practice. And then also something that's only possible once you've gotten comfortable with the parts of yourself that are triggered by this work. Because, like, at the end of the day, you know, clients are going to bring things that are really hard into the room. They're going to bring things that are really hard, really messy, really nuanced. And it's really easy for those things to become really, really activating for us as the counselor, as the doula. And so, like, you need to not have the time when you're in a session with a client, that needs to not be the first time that you've explored that part of yourself, you know?
Yes, thanks, Phebes. So let's talk a little bit about the macro. And I see the macro really as how we structure and enact this Rouge ecosystem and the way we treat each other. And again, the tools that we have and the structures that we have amongst us to manage conflict. Right now, Rouge is truly in a honeymoon period. And I hope we don't have to record this whole video after a massive rupture happens. But we're in a honeymoon period, and it's really an opportunity to think about how do we handle it when there is a conflict in our ranks, when there is a problem between several or a few people, two people, and how we can best manage that with the goal of repair and understanding instead of rupture, and we end up losing some of our doulas because of difference of opinion or misunderstandings or conflict or whatever it is. And maybe, Phoebe, if you could talk a little bit to our principles of inclusion and anti-bullying and some of these pieces as well, and whatever else comes to mind around the macro.
Yeah, sure. So I think that, you know, the thing that I really think about in terms of the macro as, you know, how we relate to each other within the organization, within the collective, is it's very, very similar. You know, this collective organism that we have built and are building with all of you, it's very similar to, you know, like, its relationship. It's the same when we have a rupture within our ranks. It's the same as when you have a rupture in your personal relationships. And the reason that I bring that up is that it's, you know, like, if you have, right, I think that we are very conflict avoidant. We tend to be very conflict avoidant within movement spaces. And I think the thing with that is, like, it's really hard to be in relationship with anyone, with an individual person or with a collective, in a way that is authentic if that relationship does not allow for any degree of conflict, does not allow for any degree of rupture and repair. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about with the macro is that we need to not be, really, really afraid of conflict and not feel like, oh my God, there's a conflict, this is going to tear everything down, because it's not. Because rupture and repair, like, you'll hear people who talk about interpersonal relationships say this all the time, like that's how we build stronger relationships with ourselves, with each other, and you know with the rest of the collective.
And that's also the difference between relational environments and transactional ones. And most working environments are patriarchal and transactional. People are there to do a job, get money, and they work within the hierarchy. And that's where there's the whole concept of a separation between work-life balance, all of that. It's because people are existing in these very transactional spheres. So if we think about working in a more matriarchal, feminine way, we're actually working in a more relational way. And that relational, more emotional approach also bleeds into the structures of a feminist organization, or should. And that's where I think we really see the disconnect in a lot of feminist organizations, and the way that they care for the people in that context, in that collective, is that they're acting from a transactional space for something that's actually incredibly relational.
Yeah, I think that, so something I say all the time is that we will not succeed in dismantling harmful systems by replicating them. And the reason I bring that up is I think that probably, many of the people in this group, maybe all, have experienced, um, you know, working in organizations or with people that are trying to enact feminist change through internal patriarchal structures. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that many of you will have seen the ways that doesn't work. It's just, you see, I think, a lot of organizations sort of this becoming what they swore to destroy type thing. And I think a lot of that is because that they are working in this very transactional, very patriarchal, very hierarchical and control based way. And so, I think we think a lot about how to move away from that. And one thing I want to bring up is that, like, this is, when we're thinking about how to move away from those structures, like, a lot of this, how you do this in a feminist organization, like in a feminist nonprofit, a lot of that has not necessarily been figured out yet, right? Like, there are many ways in which we're breaking maybe not new ground in the context of human history, but definitely new ground in the context of the space that we exist, like specifically the abortion nonprofit landscape and the feminist nonprofit landscape. And I think when you think about it that way, like, that's another just piece of how conflict is inevitable and rupture is inevitable, and the thing that defines our longevity and determines our ability to be effective and sustainable and resilient is not avoiding conflict, it's how we react to conflict, and it's how we repair after that.
Yeah. And that's an ever evolving and long-term process and journey for Rouge, and one that's going to take a lot of collective care and input.
Yeah.
So I thank everyone in advance for being on that journey, and the multiple workshops we're going to have to define this, along with the
Yeah.
great cosmic mother. Because I feel so strongly about it. Me, myself, have experienced a lot of movement trauma. And I would say, I would even define it as bullying at times. And I think the only way to repair it is not to replicate it and be like, oh, these young bitches need to go through what we went through to get to the top. Like, we need to actually create environments that don't replicate that trauma and are safe landing points for young feminists to come and be mentored and to grow and become the best versions of themselves without trauma holding them back and preventing them from creating their big dreams. So
Well, and one thing I want to note is how this ties back into the micro, right? Because we think about, you know, when we think about like feminist organizations that rumble under the weight of this relational conflict, like where is that coming from, right? It's coming from having individuals who are externalizing, right, the harm that patriarchy has enacted upon all of us. And
Right.
acting in ways like it's all, I think, comes like so much of this comes back to like movement trauma and the ways that our past experiences have taught us to relate to each other in these spaces, in these ways that have protected us in the past. And I think it all comes back to like meeting the parts of yourself that have been harmed, and the parts of yourself that are confused, and the parts of yourself that like are in these spaces and yet still bringing the outside patriarchal trauma and conditioning that we all have, and being willing to acknowledge that. And so like I think that we're going to talk about the global in a second, and we'll probably talk about how that ties back into all of these. But I think it's just important to kind of draw these connections and, remember that like when we talk about the micro, that's we as individuals. And then we talk about the macro, us as a group, that group is made up of individuals, and it is us as that group that is going to interact with the outside world in terms of clients and other organizations and all of that. So I think it's just really important to remember like that those connections are there. And I think that a lot of what we're doing at Rouge is um and what you'll hear people talk about this throughout the course, we'll have discussions about it, but one of the things that we're doing is really trying to be an organization that is able to acknowledge the holistic and messy nature of the abortion experience. And I think that's a philosophy that very much is impossible to enact if we don't carry that in the ways that we relate to ourselves and each other.
Yes, Phoebe, amazing. Amazingly put all of that. And that's a great segue also into the global. Because another thing of what we're really trying to do here at Rouge and with this 6-month container is create a shared language between all of us. So when we talk about abortion ambivalence, we all know exactly what we mean. A client is ambivalent and has a moral conflict. We all know exactly what that means. We all have shared tools. We're all able to support each other in a certain way that we all know what we're talking about a wide expanse of things in the abortion world. And that's really a strength, because I think also from the micro, we're all coming with different backgrounds and different levels of knowledges and depth in different areas. And that shared language right now doesn't exist between all of us. So in our desire to provide global care, having a shared language of how we talk about clients and then the different methodologies we employ to care for clients is really key to providing a kind of unified care, but also to allowing us to have a real global voice, and also a unified movement within our ranks that is just incredibly powerful and nourishing.
Definitely. And like just to give an example of how this manifests in practice, we had a doula the other day in our Rosie's group chat with all of our doulas on the roster that you will eventually have the opportunity to join. We had a doula who had a client who was experiencing like suicidality and just these pretty intense things, and the doula was able to reach out to the group chat and be like, hey, I don't feel equipped for this. And you had like a bunch of people, including me, including Lynsey, lots of different people kind of helping her to work through that in real time and saying, here are the tools from the toolbox that you already have, that like you learned in the course that we all learned together. Here are the tools that you might try using, like here's, so that kind of shared language and that shared understanding manifests when we're working with clients. One way that it manifests is it makes it really really easy for our doulas in the collective to collaborate and work through these more difficult cases, so that that client's doula can provide like the best support possible. Lynsey, you're muted.
Exactly. And that's also the magic of having this collective language and collective voice, because the doula that wasn't feeling totally comfortable or equipped knew exactly what to ask for in the rest of the doulas. And so that really allows us to provide a more unified care. And also in that, we work really hard at creating an environment. And currently with the first cohort, or the Rosy doulas, which is about 45 right now, everyone is pretty comfortable to speak their mind and express vulnerabilities or where they're not feeling completely equipped or safe. And that's an environment that's really, really privileged, and something that we feel really strongly about continuing to steward.
Yeah, and just to kind of explicitly tie that back into the macro, into the micro, you guys are already probably like thinking of all of these ways they connect, but I just want to point out that like that interaction was only possible because that doula, both because of the space that we've cultivated, but also because of, her own internal work that she'd done at some point, able to, because like I think about like a patriarchal kind of working environment, right? Where the standard is very much not to say like, I don't feel equipped for this, I don't know what to do, help.
Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, exactly. And so like we may have, cohort one students watching this, so, and current doulas watching this. So if that person is watching this, like it was really, really cool and really awesome to see her, like in real time start this uh conversation that was just all of these doulas collaborating, and like that was only possible because she had done the work to feel safe operating in a way that is like pretty frowned upon and kind of risky in a patriarchal environment, a patriarchal working environment.
So what else is a Rouge doula, Phoebe? How is a Rouge doula in the global context? How do we want to operate with clients?
Well, I mean, we talked about the neutral mirror thing, and I think that's one piece. And we can talk about that more, obviously. But another piece that I just want to bring in is, and you'll hear me talk about this all the time. You'll hear Lynsey talk about this all the time. You'll hear like everybody talk about this all the time. But the ability to hold intensity with a client, right? And we can use the same example of that doula who had a client who was experiencing this kind of intense like suicidality. um I think there's this like instinct in a lot of us, me as well, when you're with a client and they bring something really heavy into the room, like the bombshells, the I feel like I'm killing my baby, the God doesn't love me anymore, the I want to kill myself, like it's really easy as a counselor and a doula to contract away from that and get really really scared and be like, fuck, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to fix this person's problem, like this is so intense, I have no idea what to say, and because of that we freeze up and we kind of contract. And what that and that is can be really harmful to the client, right? Because they're bringing this thing that, they know it's intense. That's the reason they've maybe never even said it before to someone else, maybe even to themselves. Like they know it's intense, they can feel that, and they're paying attention to how you react. And so in that moment, if you have this really contractive response, it often, I mean, almost makes the client feel like ashamed because they're noticing that and they're feeling like, oh no, I made this person uncomfortable. And that's sort of the last thing we want our clients to be thinking in a counseling session.
Or
And
referring them
also,
out to like a hotline or something like this.
yeah,
The
yeah.
two lose
And
the client, make them feel like they're beyond help.
yeah, I mean, and the other thing I will say about like hotline referrals, and we'll talk more about suicidality at some point, but especially when you get a client who's like suicidal and you say, all right, here's crisis text line, bye, like, or reach out to me after you call them. The thing is, like, the reality is that most times that person is just not going to seek care again. Because there's a pretty high emotional barrier to asking for help, to reaching out to someone, to seeking care. I mean, we need to remember that when our clients come to us, we're strangers and they have no idea what they're getting into. Like they have no proof that we're safe people. They're doing a huge amount of trusting us in coming to us for this, right? And so that is a really high emotional barrier. It takes a lot, especially when you're maybe already in a place where you don't have a ton of additional capacity. So if you say, okay, well, you're suicidal, cool, go do this other thing, go talk to these other people, the likelihood is that person just isn't going to. They're not going to reach out again because they did it once, they overcame that emotional barrier once, and now they feel like ashamed that they came to the wrong place, or like Lynsey said, that they're beyond help. And I think this is another thing that ties right back into the micro, right? Because like as much as I'm sitting here and saying like don't do that, it's really hard not to do that. Like that is our ingrained reaction. I mean, we could talk for hours and hours about the ways that like patriarchy and colonialism ingrain these reactions into us of separation, of that's too intense, I need to run away. And so, like, the question that we're really all asking ourselves is like, how do we get comfortable moving toward the client in that moment instead of away? How do we get comfortable seeking connection in that moment and investigating and being curious and still remaining neutral?
Thanks, Phoebe. And I think that's a great place to close it for today. And we'd love to hear your guys' comments. If you want to pop them in the Mighty chat, we can have a bit of discussion around this and what it really means to be an abortion doula in these times. So thank you so much,
Absolutely.
guys.
Yeah. Thank you guys for being here, and we'll see you next class.